I don't know if it's, but I think everybody can hear me. I'm the president of WIIS. Welcome to this roundtable on right-wing and religious violent extremism. This roundtable is part of a series of roundtables that looks at gender dimensions of important international security challenges. And this is, these roundtables are being organized in partnership with the Embassy of Liechtenstein. And I'd like to recognize Ambassador Kurt Jaeger for his support of these roundtables, as well as his colleague Matt Keller of the Embassy of Liechtenstein. One of our objectives with these roundtables is also to bring together different communities. As you know, Washington is a very siloed city, where people in the security community stay in that little bubble and that silo, and people of the women, peace and security and gender community stay in their community. And one of the things that we're hoping to achieve with these roundtables is also get a discussion going between these different communities. Before we go on, I'd like to give the floor to Ambassador Jaeger for a few words of welcome. And Maya, maybe you can give the microphone to Ambassador Jaeger.
Well, thank you everybody for coming, despite the fact that this is streamed. That is not good for turnout normally when you stream things by other think tanks. And it's, I think, a very timely issue to discuss the topic of today. I'm especially grateful for you, Chantal, and Sarah, and the rest of the team of WIIS for their efforts to put together yet another fantastic group of speakers to address this very new topic, that of right-wing and religious violent extremism. The recent events at mosques in New Zealand, as you heard, and the church facilities in Sri Lanka, or the attack at the synagogue in California, remind us that the so-called war on terror takes on many faces and is not bound to geography nor to background war. There's no doubt that extremism is on the rise. We've seen this quite extended period of time as people around the world lose faith, that's my belief, in their political leaders. Some turn out to move towards extreme forms of expressing themselves, acting out based on narrow political and cultural ideologies. Online radicalization, social media, and other digital forms have been able to fuel propaganda and reach millions of people in the past, enabling hate to spread at an incredibly fast pace. Our information age has meant vast amounts of disinformation, fear-mongering, and hate as people willingly choose to follow accounts that support their personal political narrative, ignoring and even shunning counter-arguments and viewpoints. Healthy dialogue is diminished. Confirmation bias has become a widespread phenomenon. In the 2017 analysis, we came across the global terrorism database done at the University of Maryland. A dramatic increase in the number of attacks by right-wing extremism is recorded, a rise from 6% in the period between 2000 and 2010 to 35% between 2011 and 2017. And the number of attacks by religious extremists also increased, even larger, from 9% to 53% over these two time periods. And interestingly, and in contrast, terror attacks around the world fell from about 17,000 in 2014 to roughly 11,000 in 2017. Still large numbers, but it's a counter trend. And during this time period in the Middle East, terrorist attacks actually dropped by nearly 40%. Europe is also not immune. Our country is a European country. We're facing these threats to these manifestations of extremism, seeing a surge of far-right and xenophobic violence amid an influx of migrants and refugees. In 2017, Europol, the European Police Corporation Agency, reported a near doubling in the number of people arrested for right-wing extremist crimes, a trend that many see as catapulted by social media and an unhealthy mixture of populist politics, like all over the world nowadays, economic inequality, and an anger towards what are even seen as liberal elites and institutions, like it or not. It appears that much of this explanation can also be applied to extremism in this country, where there's also been a rise in cases involving hate-based and religious-based crime. As the rise in extremism is evident, the question is, how do we change this tide? How do we help communities resist violent extremism and radicalization? How do we stop the flow of right-wing politics becoming embedded in our democratic institutions, or undermining the democratic development in other countries? And how do we protect the people's rights in doing so? Well, I look forward, of course, to hearing the viewpoints of our presenters today with a larger group, very reputable people, and from the audience, of course, as well, to build on a discussion that, in my view, must become a regular fixture in our dialogue in peacekeeping. Of course, interesting to see how you will make the curve into the gender aspects of the issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before I turn it over to Whitney, my program assistant at WIIS and a colleague of mine, I also want to thank Sarah Kenny for actually putting together this wonderful panel. So let's start, Maya. Maybe you want to introduce briefly our panelists, and then we'll start the discussion. Please.
Yep, absolutely. So thank you to all of our panelists and everyone for being here today. Just starting in alphabetical order, Audrey is a senior research fellow at the George Washington Project on Extremism. She specializes in the role of digital communications technology in terrorism and studies the radicalization of women. Kurt Jaeger, the ambassador of the Principality of Liechtenstein to the United States. He and his team have been a fantastic supporter of our policy roundtable series, which is envisaged to explore the gender dimensions of our present-day international security challenges, and we would like to thank him again for his continued support. Sarah Kenny is now senior program assistant, congratulations, Sarah, with WIIS, and served as student body president at the University of Virginia in 2017 during the Unite the Right rallies. She has conducted extensive research on the alt-right since then, and she's going to be a fantastic voice in today's panel. Mary McCord serves as senior litigator from practice at the Institute of Constitutional Advocacy and Protection, ICAPS, as well as visiting professor of law at Georgetown. She was senior litigator at ICAPS during their filing on behalf of the city of Charlottesville against the Unite the Right organizers in 2017. Erin Miller manages the Global Terrorism Database at the START headquarters at the University of Maryland. The Global Terrorism Database is the premier database on terrorism in the United States. Cynthia Miller-Idriss is a professor of education and sociology at American University. She specializes in European and specifically German youth far-right radicalization. And finally, Rosand is the director of the Prevention Project, organizing against violent extremism, and is a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution Project on U.S. relations with the Islamic world. And I'm going to hand it back over to Chantal and I so that we can get the panel going.
Maya, why don't you start?
So kicking it off to Erin Miller, we hope to start off our panel discussion with defining and sort of situational framing. So to start, how do you define violent right-wing extremism versus the extremist with sort of the right-wing versus the religious extremism?
Do I need a microphone?
Yeah, why don't you do the microphone, because maybe then the phone picks it up better.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation to participate. I really appreciate it. So the project that I work on, the Global Terrorism Database, we actually start with sort of a general definition of terrorism, and we, on sort of an idiosyncratic basis, we do certain projects like the report that the ambassador mentioned earlier that focuses on specific ideological topics. So I wanted to focus on two sort of types of challenges that we face when we're sort of considering this general landscape. The first type is behavioral considerations, so defining types of behaviors. The database that we have at the University of Maryland is focused on terrorism, but it's extremely important to recognize that no behavior, including terrorism, takes place in a vacuum, right? It's all part of a broader context, and there's a tendency, I think, sometimes when you're sort of taking advantage of a large database like the Global Terrorism Database to sort of get tunnel vision, which I think is problematic. And it's important to remember that terrorism and extremist violence takes place in the context of war and has sort of as part of a puzzle that fits in with hate crime and so on and so forth. And so there's a very broad landscape that is in fact particularly relevant with right-wing violence and extremism that wouldn't qualify for inclusion in our database necessarily, but is still certainly very harmful and problematic. And you can even extend that beyond violence to other harmful activities like housing discrimination that are sort of underpinned by a particular ideological perspective, whether sort of implicit or explicit. And so there's this very broad landscape of behaviors to consider in terms of what the overall threat looks like, what the overall consequences are for quality of life, and it's important to always put that into context. And then the second part is the ideological component. So how do we sort of wrap our heads around what this means? We use the term right-wing a lot. I think it's actually kind of a terrible term. It's not particularly descriptive, it's very relative, it's very fluid, it sort of evolves over time and place in terms of what exactly it means. It tends to be sort of connected to electoral politics in problematic ways that are not always necessarily sort of consistent or meaningful. And so what I tend to do, or I'm trying to do more of, is focus on the actual sort of belief systems. What are the beliefs, the views that sort of make up this context? And there are many of them, and they overlap in really complex ways. So, have white supremacy and neo-Nazism and white nationalism and more of an anti-government focus, male supremacy, and all, sort of a variety of ideological beliefs that seem to have a lot of overlap and a lot in common. And there's certainly, if you were doing sort of a latent construct analysis on this or something like that, there's some commonality there, and I think that defining what that is a big challenge that we have that is important, whether you use the term far right to explain that. I can actually, just for sort of reference, the report that the ambassador mentions, the definition of right-wing extremism that we use there is violence in support of the belief that personal or national way of life is under attack and is either already lost or that the threat is imminent. So that's sort of a commonality that these beliefs have, characterized by anti-globalism, racial or ethnic supremacy or nationalism, suspicion of centralized federal authority, reverence for individual liberty, and belief in conspiracy theories that involve grave threat to national sovereignty or personal identity. And so that's a definition that we have used for that sort of constellation of beliefs that have a great deal of overlap. You asked about religious terrorism as well. That is a bit more self-defined, right? Religions are much better understood than some of these contexts, than some of these other contexts, and despite the fact that there is the people who invoke religious views to support their acts of violence have a completely warped sort of interpretation of those religious views. There's still more of a existing construct that we can sort of rely on to define that category of belief systems and things like that. But in general, those are sort of the challenges that we face when we're trying to better understand what this category of behaviors and how they relate to the ideas that support them.
Okay. Do you have an alternative then for the how we should call the?
I think that's a great question. I've actually been part of a number of discussions in recent sort of months trying to say, well, what is that then? If far right, if right wing is just a terrible, non-descriptive and problematic in many ways kind of term, what is that thing that is there a term that can describe that sort of the ideology that you're under threat and that kind of thing? I can tell you that in these discussions, we've only come up with just really terrible alternatives, right? So we have not succeeded. So I mean, I'm certainly happy to hear what the people in the room have to say about that. You know, there's two problems. One is coming up with the term, and then the other is sort of fighting the tide of you know, far right is an accepted term, right? The sort of the reality. Anyone who's trying to reinvent that is going to be fighting an uphill battle in terms of adoption of a new descriptor. And so instead, what I've tended to do instead was just focus on those more granular ideological beliefs. And so we're working on some projects, on some analysis that do focus on, okay, well, aside from this umbrella term, what are the actual beliefs? And what are the challenges associated with that? And you run into many. There are, you know, with sort of the idiosyncrasies of data collection, you say, well, is this person or is this event pro-white supremacy or anti-immigration? I mean, obviously both, but, you know, if you have to sort of categorize things in nice, neat ways, you know, anti-Semitic or, you know, neo-Nazi, right? Like, what are the, you find that many of these have both sort of pro-something and anti-something in the same sentiment. And so we focus a little bit more on the more granular beliefs, the very specific beliefs, because I think that's, you know, it's more descriptive, more informative.
But then context, of course, also becomes very important. Cynthia, how does that look? I mean, you've looked a lot at, let's call it for now, right-wing or neo-Nazi terrorism and radicalization in Germany in particular, and also I think in other European countries. So maybe two questions. What's your, and second, how does this look in Europe and elsewhere?
Great. Well, thank you also for the invitation and for the fascinating lineup we have here for the discussion. These are great questions to have, and I completely agree with Erin. I think that I use the term far right. I think most people, most scholars I know in the US anyway, have adopted the term far right as the best bad term that there is to describe the phenomenon. But one of the reasons why I find it an unsatisfactory term is because it doesn't work across national contexts all that well. In the German context, there's a legal distinction between right-wing extremism and right-wing radicalism. Right-wing extremism are actions that fall outside of the legal realm and are outside of, they are counter to democracy, and they fall outside of they work against the Constitution. And criminal acts are marked with a right-wing extremist designation if they are categorized that way. Police also monitor right-wing radical acts, which fall within the legitimate frame of the Constitution and of democratic practice, but are troubling. And so they're monitored, but not illegal. And that distinction in Germany, I think, is helpful, but hasn't carried over to other contexts. So then in the UK, you have people speaking about right-wing radicalism, typically, or the radical right, to capture the whole spectrum. Here in the US, we mostly use now the term the far right to capture the whole spectrum much more sloppily. We have hate crime designations here. Other countries don't have that. So there are national contexts that matter, but I think that the best thing that people can do is explain the term they're using, explain that it's a spectrum, explain that this includes, part of it also what complicates it is that different groups and different movements adopt different components of that spectrum. So you'll have groups that espouse pro-LGBTQ rights, for example, but are anti-immigrant or anti-Islam. You have groups, so it's not always the same, and sometimes they link those two together, right? So as a way of positioning themselves as pro-Western or pro-Christian values. So you have different groups that are maybe anti-government, but may not be anti-government. You have far-right groups working within governments, you have far-right groups working against governments. And so part of the challenge of that spectrum is that there are different components and there's a kind of mix that has to be understood in any given context. So I think, you know, as a writer, as an author, every author I know who works on the far right, the first thing they do is define the term, spend 3 or 4 pages of their book or their article explaining why they use this term and what it means to them. But I think importantly across contexts, it's important to learn from what others do and understand that I often get critiqued for using right-wing extremism, for example, when I talk, if I'm talking about the German context, by people who aren't familiar with the fact that that's a legal designation. And so I think that's important to always bear in mind, is that different legal contexts will use different words as well.
Yeah, so moving over to Audrey, sort of a two-pronged question. Can you speak more generally on the role of online platforms and radicalization processes for violent extremist groups? And do you think there's a difference on how these platforms facilitate radicalization for men and women?
Well, thank you guys so much for having me. It's fantastic to sort of be among people when I use their research regularly. So what I'm here to talk about is sort of the two-pronged question, but also looking at the role of digital communications technology, but not just in terms of propaganda, but what it actually means for gender dimensions. So a lot of my research is focused on, unsurprisingly, like most people in the terrorism community, jihadist use of these platforms, but ultimately, because these are tools, there's a lot of transferability when we look at how it changes people's access to the community. So in that base of research, and I'm going to sort of lay out and talk about what we can learn from there, and then sort of transition to talk about women online and the far right. But some of the research about women in jihadist groups say that although they represent a smaller part of online networks, they tend to have superior network connectivity, which means a lot for the endurance of these online networks. Next, women use tools in a lot of different ways, whether it's funding, facilitating, recruitment, propaganda dissemination. So there's not really just one monolithic use of these tools, but really a broad set of behaviors. Next, beyond reducing the geographic barriers for supporting a terrorist organization, it's important to recognize how these tools make ideas and movements way more accessible to demographics that they might not necessarily, whether they're younger generations or access for women when women aren't conventionally encouraged to engage and participate in open forums. And then the opportunities afforded by features like anonymity, public and private messaging, and moderated groups can concurrently offer ways to reinforce or subvert gender norms. So whether I'm pretending to be a man online, which is something that we've seen before, or whether I'm actually allowed to be somewhat more influential and outspoken and not necessarily position myself as a leader, but become sort of like a thought leader within the community, especially pertaining to the role of women within this community. So similarly, I think that the virtual sphere can pave a way for women to garner influence online, especially in these masculine dominant organizations, in ways that the organization might not conventionally condone in the real world. So again, you won't really see women that often seen sort of as the face of the movement, and yet in the online arena, from sort of the persuasion of alt-right to far right, and again, I realize that these terms are so murky, but it's a really useful lens to start assessing these as we look at these personas online. And we need to understand this dimension that technology has on gender and accessibility to women, because it's something that's really, really changing the pulse. Sometimes we sort of say like, wow, there are more women than ever before. And that may not necessarily be true so much as we're seeing and hearing from them in a way that we didn't necessarily before, especially if they are influential in their communities, but now their community has moved to a virtual domain. So in a series that we worked on at the Program on Extremism called Perspectives on the Future of Women, Gender, and Violent Extremism, shameless plug here, I got a great contribution from Julia Ebner and Jacob Davey that was looking at how women have actually helped transnationalize the far right, or whatever working lexicon we're using. And especially looking at the role of technology in that, whether it's YouTube channels, blogs, talking about traditional wives, and sort of these different ideas and how they make them so accessible to the community. And their viewership is really, really high. And sometimes this can be a strength for the organizations, and sometimes it can be a tension, especially when women are critiqued or trolled by other members of the movement. And not all of them are, so I think that this is sort of an experimental place for the organizations. And then looking at how platforms are dealing with it. Earlier, before the event, we were talking about how Etsy kicked off one woman because she's been selling these pro-Aryan belts, and she's like, hey, they won't allow me to sell my doilies. She's also making hand crochet doilies. Diverse spectrum of things. But looking at other things like social media platforms, funding platforms, clothing stores, I printed out, here we have, this is, I know it's really small, but these are 2 t-shirts. One says they have to go back, and this is a woman who's really more part of the, sorry, oh yeah, that one's bigger. They have to go back, and then next to it is a shield maiden picture, and they have kids t-shirts. And these are all sort of deeply rooted in parts of the organization, and how women are sort of mainstreaming this by saying like, hey, you can buy this shirt online for $35 and get your kid a matching one. So even though it's not necessarily this super overt problem, this is exactly how women see themselves as sort of making the movement softer and accessible. And it really plays into the narrative that they see for themselves within the movement and enforcing that traditional role of making these ideas mainstream. So with that, I will.
Yes, thank you so much. So sort of talking about the far right again, and an event that really sort of extends across the panel. Sarah, you were student body president at University of Virginia during Unite the Right. For those of you who aren't familiar, Unite the Right took place at University of Virginia in 2017 in Charlottesville. Can you speak to how these events informed your research on the alt-right? In particular, what are some gender myths that come along with the alt-right?
Sure. So, thank you. In the aftermath of Unite the Right, I turned to academia as a way to process some of the raw challenges that my community and I were facing in Charlottesville. And I was looking at images of the rallies that took place through the lawn, the rotunda, and the downtown mall where the majority of the protests took place, and asked myself the question, where were the women? Did the women matter? Why would women join groups that seemed fundamentally counterintuitive to their own self-interest? So the argument went in the kind of a burgeoning literature I saw on the subject. In the age of Trump, this connection of the far right, and again, this speaks to kind of the sloppiness of the term, was very much tied to kind of widespread questioning of why so many white women supported Donald Trump for president. And so I decided to look into these questions and ended up framing my analysis around 3 central myths about who joins the alt-right, how they join the alt-right, and why they join the alt-right, and focused my research mostly on the United States. And the kind of central myth that I think we have already begun to dispel here is that a member of an extremist group is just a deviant, hate-filled skinhead with tattoos who acts on his own deeply held hostilities towards the victim's social group. And this is an example of belief-driven activism. They're a racist going to try and be as violent as possible. It's a much more complex social process than that. So that was one myth I tried to really dispel about who these people were. Estimates on the number of women in these groups are challenging, due in large part to the online organizing nature of these groups. Sites go up and down as different regulations change across borders, across governments, but the estimates I've seen put women's participation at around 15 to 25% in a lot of these groups, which is definitely a significant amount of the force, and they do play a distinct role in these movements. And the kind of final myth that I tried to interact with in my research was this idea that, okay, so maybe women are part of these groups, sure, but they're just following a boyfriend, they're following a husband, they're irrational, they're not political actors with agency. That's not the case in the articulation that a lot of these actors are making for why they join these groups. And this brings us to the point about why gender isn't just an element of analysis, a lens that we can use to look at this problem, but it's really fundamental to the questions of extremist ideology that we're speaking about today. A quote from one of the preeminent scholars on the subject, Professor Blee of sociology, says that gender isn't just peripheral to the right, it's paramount. And we can understand how men feel compelled to join some of these groups with a more overt appeal to traditionalism, economic stability, and national resurgence. But women are crafting a unique nationalist articulation for their participation as well. Lana Lotkeff is by some referred to as kind of the queen bee of the alt-right. She is a very prominent organizing figure, and she equates nationalism to the values of womanhood, so tying gender to the state in a really profound way, saying that beauty, family, and the home are what they're fighting for, and relies on Nordic ideology such as the shield woman.
This is her store.
Yeah, wow, okay.
Lana's store.
The rise of the symbol of the Valkyrie to call women to fight this kind of final battle, which is endemic to extremist ideologies across right-wing, far-right, and religious ideologies. So women are part of these movements, and they are sustaining future generations of these movements in ways that I think scholarship is pretty dangerously ignored to this point.
Thank you very much, Sarah.
Before I turn to Eric and to, I see a lot of similarities actually between jihadist violent extremism and this, what for now we'll call far right or right wing. But before we do that, I want to turn to Mary McCord and ask Mary, how do we deal with these different types of terrorism in the United States in particular, and maybe more generally? Because I think we are making politically some distinctions between the two, and we're not having similar ways of looking at them, both in the legal side as well as politically. So please, Mary.
Thank you. Thanks again. So in addition to bringing this case in Charlottesville that I'm happy to talk about later during the roundtable, I had been the Principal Deputy Assistant Attorney General and then later the Acting Assistant Attorney General for National Security at the Department of Justice between May 2014 to May 2017 when I left the government. I'd been a prosecutor for 20 years before that, federal prosecutor. And so May 2014 was 1 month, of course, before the Islamic State declared a caliphate and began the summer of hostage takings and beheadings over social media, massive recruitment via social media of fighters to travel, foreign terrorist fighters to travel from all over Western Europe, Southeast Asia, Australia, and of course also the United States. And it was the first time we had seen such prolific and skilled use of social media as this type of recruitment tool. Al-Qaeda didn't really have that at the time. It has grown so significantly since then. And so the US counterterrorism regime, beginning really post 9/11, although it existed before that, but post 9/11, so much emphasis got put onto counterterrorism as a way to prevent terrorist attacks as opposed to simply respond to terrorist attacks after they occurred. And that involved being very, very proactive. I mean, I can tell you, first of all, it involved a ton of resources. I can remember I was at the US Attorney's Office in DC in 9/11, and like the entire federal bank robbery FBI squad got all shifted to counterterrorism. It was just kind of interesting, like everything shifted priorities to counterterrorism, not inappropriately at all. It's just amazing to see that humongous resource shift. And the approach, the counterterrorism program in the United States is very proactive. It involves agents, and I'm not even talking about using foreign intelligence surveillance tools at all. I'm just talking about using normal criminal tools that the US government uses in all kinds of criminal investigations. But it involved, going online first into public chat rooms, public social media, seeing who's talking about jihad, who's talking about wanting to travel, who's talking about wanting to acquire precursors to weapons of mass destruction or AK-47s and that kind of thing. The FBI going undercover in the form of online personas undercover to engage with would-be jihadists, and oftentimes then do a sting operation, provide the inert materials for a bomb, go with the person to, sometimes it was, outside a military facility or someplace else, a Christmas tree lighting event, and when the person is about ready to push the button to detonate the bomb, you take down that case, you make the arrest, you prosecute. And there's an entire chapter of the U.S. Federal Criminal Code that includes a variety of different terrorism offenses, but the one used most commonly for foreign terrorist organization-inspired violence and attempts is the material support statute, and that criminalizes providing material support or resources to a designated foreign terrorist organization. Now, our government, through the State Department, designates foreign organizations as terrorist organizations, but it does not designate domestic organizations as terrorist organizations, primarily because of the serious First Amendment concerns that would result in. And you might say, what about the foreign organizations? Well, foreign organizations are not here in the United States. They don't have First Amendment rights. And so the U.S. government doesn't have to deal with that same sort of backlash. Now, there have been cases, of course, where people have raised First Amendment concerns with providing support to some of these organizations, and there's been the Supreme Court case, Holder v. Humanitarian Law Project, where a group of people here, or organizations here, who wanted to provide funding to some of the humanitarian sides of foreign terrorist organizations, argued that they had a First Amendment right to do so, and that was rejected ultimately by the Supreme Court. But at any rate, the vast majority, the highest percentage of U.S. prosecutions of terrorism offenses are for material support, because you can charge someone who's getting ready to go on an airplane to travel to Syria or travel to Turkey and enter Syria and join ISIS with attempted material support, attempt to provide oneself as support to ISIS, a designated foreign terrorist organization. On the domestic terrorism side, and by that I mean terrorism not occurring domestically, because going to a U.S. airport to get on a plane to fly to Turkey is happening domestically, but the crime that's charged is considered an international terrorism crime because it is in furtherance of the goals of a foreign terrorist organization. Domestic terrorism, when using it here for purposes of this discussion, I'm referring to terrorism that's not inspired by a foreign terrorist organization or Islamist extremism arising from a foreign terrorist organization, but other political and sociological ideologies, white supremacy, anarchist, sovereign citizens, even environmental extremism. It crosses the spectrum left to right in terms of extremism, although the greatest lethality of domestic inspired extremism is from the far right, not from these other forms of extremism. So right now there is no crime on the books that penalizes acts of violence, and there's a few exceptions I'll get to, acts of violence committed in furtherance of these domestic political and sociological ideologies like white supremacy. The exceptions are, there are terrorism offenses that apply to use, conspiracy, or attempt to use a weapon of mass destruction. So if you attempt to use a bomb, even if you're inspired by your white supremacy, we can charge you, I'm not there anymore, the government can charge you with conspiracy to use weapon of mass destruction, and that's a crime under the terrorism chapter of the code. If the attack is plotted against U.S. officials, government officials, or U.S. government property, those are also terrorism offenses, whether they're inspired by Islamist extremism or white supremacy or some other extremism. But if you are talking about using a firearm, which the vast majority of attacks here in the U.S. involve firearms, and it's not against a U.S. government official, so think Tree of Life Synagogue, think the most recent attack in Poway, these are with firearms, you don't have a terrorism charge that you can bring. If a person uses their vehicle, and we saw in 2015, 2016, in terms of Islamist extremist violence, we saw use of the vehicle all over Western Europe, Southeast Asia, other places, and now we've seen it here. James Fields in Charlottesville, Virginia, at the end of the Unite the Right rally, of course, used his vehicle to ram into a crowd of counter-protesters, tragically killing Heather Heyer and seriously injuring scores of other people. That's not a weapon of mass destruction, although one could argue it can be, but it's not thought of that, it's not within the definition of our criminal code, and otherwise that there's no domestic terrorism offense that can be applied to that. So this has a number of consequences. One, it means we don't, as a government, and we tend not to, leadership in this country, government leadership, particularly right now, tends not to equate the domestic extremist threat with the Islamic extremist threat. And that's just wrong. It's wrong morally, and it's wrong as a matter of data, because as I indicated, and I think some of the other speakers have indicated, lethality in this country right now, the lethality of violent extremism is greater from far-right extremism than it is from Islamist extremism, putting 9/11 aside, of course. It also means, so there's a moral equivalency that I think should be addressed with a domestic terrorism offense. There's also the resource issue, and that's why I started out by talking about resources. When the FBI does not sort of have a crime at the end of its investigation, it's not going to put the same, and we can criticize that, and we can say, why don't they put more resources to hate crimes? But it's different agents doing hate crimes investigations than the agents that do terrorism investigations. Agents who do terrorism investigations know about terrorism, whether it's Islamist extremist terrorism or whether it's domestic inspired terrorism. And the resources have not been put toward that, partly because there's oftentimes not going to be a crime at the end of the day. So you go do your online undercover persona and you bump up against somebody, you're still not going to have a domestic terrorism crime that you can charge them with. And data is another thing. We have horrible data. There's voluntary reporting of hate crimes, which we know is wildly under counted. For example, in Charlottesville, Virginia, the Charlottesville Police Department reported 0 hate crimes for 2017. 0. Now, before you think they're horrible people, their view was that means we had to have charged a hate crime to report it. But Virginia does not have a general hate crime statute. They have a statute against putting swastikas on places and nooses and things like that and cross burnings, but they don't have just a general hate crime statute the way the US federal government does. So their view is, yeah, we arrested a lot of people and a lot of people committed acts of violence, but we didn't charge them with hate crimes, so we reported nothing. But that's a good illustration of how horrible the data is on this. So with at least the consideration of a crime of domestic terrorism, you could at least get better data on it. And I know there's a lot of criticisms, which I'm happy to talk to. I don't want to use up all the time, and concerns in the civil rights community that if you had this crime of domestic terrorism, won't the FBI go after Black Lives Matter? Won't they go after the wrong groups? So one thing that can be done to address that is oversight. You know, Congress saying, report to us how many investigations you're opening up and what buckets they're in. Like you mentioned the different types. You know, is it white racial extremism? Is it anarchist extremism? Is it Black nationalist extremism? What is it? And if what they say they're reporting is wildly off base from what we're seeing, the threat picture in the real world, then they have to answer to that, and that's a powerful deterrent. So, and with this, I think comes the imperative, the moral imperative for our government leaders to speak more directly to the domestic terrorist threat. We have seen with Christopher Paul Hassan, the Coast Guard lieutenant who was stockpiling weapons, which by the way could be addressed if we changed our counterterrorism regime. We did see the U.S. Attorney's Office refer to him as a domestic terrorist. That's one of the very few times I've seen that happen.
Do you know how our allies, European countries deal with this?
I don't know exactly how their regimes are. In fact, maybe Cynthia or Erin is better, or even Eric is better equipped at that. But I will say one of the other things that I think we've seen really changing recently, or at least coming to the front, is the internationalization of domestic terrorism. I mean, certainly after Christchurch, it was obvious, the man committing that crime, had traveled, of course, from Australia to New Zealand, but he'd been on a world tour before that and got his inspiration from, you know, far-right extremists in Europe, such as Anders Breivik, and people here in the US, such as Dylan Roof. And so, and we certainly know there's very, very violent organizations in Western Europe. There's organizations here, Atomwaffen, very violent, the Rise Above movement, that are taking their inspiration from some of the European groups. And so Nick Rasmussen, the former head of NCTC, the National Counterterrorism Center, myself, and Joshua Geltzer, who also comes from the previous White House Counterterrorism Policy Directorate, have recently written a piece about, frankly, the need to do much more work internationally to share information, data about these organizations, these groups, the way we do on the religious, Islamist extremist side. Governments share information all the time, and that's how we know about the threat, and that just hasn't been done on the far-right extremism side.
Let me turn to Eric. Eric, you've worked for a long time on jihadist violent extremism. I wonder if you could talk both in terms of how you see sort of similarities between these two types of violent extremism, as well as the, talk a little bit about the challenges in trying to address right-wing violent extremism at the international level. I understood that the UN Security Council recently had a closed debate on this issue, and I don't know if you have any information on that, but please.
Thank you. I think sort of picking up on where a couple of the speakers left off in terms of the sort of international dimension, I think one thing is, as Mary alluded to, there's, I think, little doubt that there are numerous international dimensions to the quote-unquote domestic or right-wing terrorism conundrum. But I think despite that, it's a much different animal when you bring it in, when you try to go international on the issue and try to sort of tap into some of the frameworks or some of the multilateral bodies that exist out there that have spent a lot of time since 9/11 on jihadi terrorism. And I think one reason why you have this it's almost apples and oranges is because of the political, the much closer tie to political parties that exist when you're talking about right-wing terrorism. In a number of countries around the world, there are, their parliaments include a sliver of, or more, of a far-right political group that is in essentially mainstream politics. And it inhibits the ability of then the foreign ministry to go out and lump in the same basket the activities of fringe, perhaps fringe or not fringe, violent groups in that country with so-called jihadi terrorists. And I think you've seen that already in the G7 context, where the Canadians' foreign minister last month, I believe, at the when they were negotiating the communique that the foreign ministers issue every year at the G7, and the Canadians talked about white supremacy being the most significant terrorist threat facing Canada, and they think it's a growing threat internationally. And there was a lot of pushback, I'm told, from certain delegations on including robust language on the topic in the communique. And although hasn't been confirmed publicly, my understanding is that the principal pushback came from the United States. And so what they could get in there is language about hate, a language about intolerance, language about Islamophobia, language about anti-Semitism, which is all very good and everything, but I don't think really allows one to make the jump from the very robust domestic terrorism conversations in this country and a similar set of conversations internationally. And I think just the definitional challenges around right-wing terrorism, just here we've heard what a sort of amorphous term it is, and how it captures so many different cats and dogs. And imagine trying to take that term, which is so well defined in a domestic context, and trying to sort of get international consensus on a definition of right-wing terrorism when they can't even get a definition on sort of the ISIS-inspired terrorism. They can get consensus on a group, which is why you've seen the UN develop a list, the Security Council has a list of ISIS, Al-Qaeda affiliated organizations that are on the sanctions regime. And there's worldwide, obviously, condemnation and support for was initially stemming the flow of foreign terrorist fighters to Iraq and Syria, now how to deal with their return. And it's in part because so many countries around the world are facing the same threat. And I think with domestic terrorism and right-wing terrorism, it's really a Western industrialized world issue that is of little concern to the global South. And in fact, if you went to if there were any links to the global South, and you went and the U.S. went and talked to, let's say, Nigeria or Kenya or Egypt about this concern to the U.S., it's why should they care? In the same sense as why should we be sort of elevating to a sort of a terrorism definition or a terrorism construct what could be a very local insurgency group in that country. And so I think despite the internationalization of domestic terrorism, as it were, I think challenges exist internationalizing it. The other point I want to make quickly is, and this gets to a very domestic issue here, is with the growing number of right-wing attacks and the increasingly elevated discourse about what to do in response, I think we're finding the same kinds of discussions going on that we see in response to almost any terrorist attack in the last 20 years, which is legal, so what's the legal regime, and then increasingly social media, how do we crack down on social media companies? And so in many respects, although it is in some ways preventative, trying to sort of, as Mary was talking about, how to sort of have more tools to get to apply before an attack is committed, we're still talking about legal instruments, we're talking about arrests, we're talking about law enforcement. And it's, again, applying an existing toolkit that we have for jihadi terrorism to this new, or not new, but all of a sudden more, an issue that's getting much more attention on the domestic terrorism side. What we're not doing is looking at what are the gaps that we have in this country in dealing with jihadi terrorism or any kind of sort of extremist violence in this country, and how can we fill those gaps? So again, it's just the focus, I think, needs to be not instead of on legal and social media tools, but it's also looking at what kind of preventative tools beyond the law enforcement, beyond the arrest and prosecution, beyond the cracking down on social media companies, what kind of tools are missing in our toolbox domestically that this sort of all of a sudden elevation of domestic terrorism issues might create opportunities for us to address. And I would argue that the primary one is around a prevention architecture for a layered prevention architecture in the United States for preventing all forms of extremist violence, including both jihadi and right-wing. And that's largely missing in this country. And I think we have a great opportunity to use this unfortunate spike in right-wing violence to actually try to address it.
Okay, thank you. I want to open it up to our audience. I think we can question, though, that this is just an issue, the right-wing terrorism is just an issue for the Western world. I mean, this has obvious policy implications in terms of foreign policy, and so, should also be of concern to other countries, I think. But let me open it up, and hopefully we get a good discussion. And please introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is Courtney Radge. I'm the Advocacy Director at the Committee to Protect Journalists, and I'm interested in your perspectives about some of the legislative and regulatory efforts, especially coming out of the UK, Australia, and the EU, to regulate online hate, extremist, especially when it's it seems very focused on content. I'd just be interested in if you think, is this a valid approach? Is it going to work? There's a vast difference between the UK's proposal, which is very broad, and the Australian legislation, which is pretty narrow. So be interested in your thoughts on that.
Let's take another question, please.
My name is Kirsten Lavery. I'm with the the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. I'm interested, obviously the one side of the debate is defined by their religious beliefs, and it was mentioned that the far right, Christianity can play a role. So I'm just kind of curious to hear a bit more about what role you see religion playing in the far right, and if there's any trends about if the religion is increasingly playing into the violence that is happening.
Okay, any other? At the back, the gentleman in the yellow shirt, and then we'll go to the panel.
Well, Ken McCord, retiree. Ms. Miller, you spoke to the importance of defining terms. One of my pet peeves is the way people conflate white supremacy with white nationalism. There was a graphic example of that in the Post a couple of days ago, and they had a front page article on the relations or links between white supremacy and ISIS. And the author, to her credit, uses the term white supremacy throughout her article, but then on the second page, where the article was continued, the headline was "White Nationalism and ISIS Reciprocity." So do you make it? I don't know that much about either ideology, but just the words themselves would seem to indicate that there's a difference. White nationalism doesn't necessarily mean white supremacy. Do you make a distinction?
Okay, who wants to start it off?
So I will take this question and we can all parse it out. So a lot of my work at the Program on Extremism is trying to look at this balance between how can we regulate this content, and is content-based regulation really the only tool that we should be talking about? And I think that one of the really critical challenges is how we started addressing this problem and rolling downhill. I mean, a lot of this traces back actually to 2006 in the Baghdad sniper video, and that's the first time that Congress really asked for content-based regulation by YouTube as a part of their terms of service. So one of the challenges is, especially the UK and the increasing EU regulations, as well as what the Australian government is seeking to do, is really leverage content-based regulations when there are all of these other methods that could be really used to prevent exploitation of these platforms, not just by extremist users, but really a spectrum of actors. And it's about saying, you know, how can we make sure that we aren't automating things so much that when a journalist shares this video that it's not taken down because they are sharing content. So one of the things that I and sort of our organization is working to do is talk to people a lot more about what it means to open up their conception of compliance. So that compliance doesn't just have to be the speed of takedowns, but it can be about preventing IP hopping or preventing, you know, they have things like 10-minute email, so these burner email services. So we need to make sure that human rights activists and journalists can have access to these tools, but on what scale? So it's doable to make accounts, but if you're trying to create 180 accounts in a day, how can we sort of prevent that? So in many ways, we need to start talking about marginalizing violent extremists as opposed to just expelling them from the platforms. Because these perspectives do come from the margins, but they're using these tools to, again, mainstream. And one of the other challenges is it's not just about the major social media providers. A lot of the users that we study are not on platforms that are being called to the Hill, or should they be called to the Hill, have the ability to moderate content at the degree sort of set forth by policymakers around the world. So I think it's starting to say, look, we've tried a lot of these methods, and it's great that we sort of looked at things like the Madison Valleywood Project, but how can we actually start to push forward and think really seriously about long-term implications for both speech, because the US has a different culture of speech than a lot of our allies and partners, and what we can do as a country to sort of advance that by encouraging these other moderation techniques.
Erin?
Sure. I can address actually quickly the question about the role of religion and then the distinction between white supremacy and white nationalism. So I think these are actually both kind of related questions that all have to do with how difficult it is to apply these definitions in practice, right? There's two ways to come up with definitions. You can sit in the comfort of your office and sketch out what you think are the sort of beliefs that fall into each category, but then when you are faced with real people, it becomes a lot more complicated to classify events or individuals into categories. Sometimes it's not that hard. Sometimes these individuals and groups are fairly straightforward about their beliefs. But the role of religion is one example of how that can be fairly difficult, because in some cases people are very explicit about the role that religion plays in sort of their decision to carry out violence, for example. And in other ways it's a little bit more subtle and hard to tell. One other example of sort of where that line gets blurred is for example, in anti-abortion terrorism, right? So there are a number of groups and individuals whose anti-abortion beliefs are drawn from their religious beliefs. I think a lot of times people classify anti-abortion violence as far-right violence. I don't actually know if that's a sensible distinction given sort of what we know about the definition of this ambiguous umbrella term, or if it's more of a strictly religious sort of motivation instead. And so that's a good example of how those can overlap in really challenging ways to disentangle. And at the end of the day, I think in some cases there's not really an answer to that question. It's people are complex. When anyone goes out into the world, decides what they're going to do that day, a lot of things feed into that, whether it's personal experiences, belief systems that they hold, and that applies across the board, whether you're talking about far-right violence or you're talking about jihadist violence. There are a lot of individual personal motivators that can contribute to a person's decision to carry out violence. With respect to the question about the distinction between white supremacy and white nationalism, I agree that when you start looking at those contexts very closely, you see that there are certain distinctions in what exactly those belief systems are. For the report that we've done so far, we have not disaggregated in any of the categories within the broader far-right category. We're working on analysis now that will do that will provide a much more sort of granular assessment of what the specific beliefs and ideologies are, in which case that would be a context where there's sort of a nuanced distinction between white supremacy and white nationalism. So it all depends on how, there's sort of the general discussion of, when you're faced with an analytical question, depending on what that question is, does it make more sense to group things together or split things apart? And there's always some degree of sort of, how finite your categories should be. And as a practical matter, I'll go back to the point that it is very difficult when you're faced with information about a person, whether it's in court documents or open source reporting or things like that, trying to get some real clarity on the precision. So those more granular categories can be tough to compartmentalize in many cases.
Cynthia, you wanted to answer?
I was just going to add sort of a punt on the first question, but it's going to give me a chance to say something I wanted to say in response to an earlier point too, which is on the regulatory and the monitoring and surveillance issue, which I think is important, obviously. We need it, and I wouldn't advocate to reduce any of the many resources that have gone into it, but I think that we have to acknowledge it's at best a band-aid solution, and that we in this country have really never thought seriously or systematically about what preventative efforts would look like for any kind of extremism, I think. And one of the ways I think that manifests itself is, I will say when I'm in Germany in meetings like this or other meetings, we're all going to lots of meetings like this, inevitably a handful of people in the room are social workers. A couple people on the panel are experts in youth development or adolescent development. I never see that in the US. I don't think I've ever seen it once. That people who are experts in how young people think and what motivates them and how they are best addressed and how pedagogical interventions might best reach them. I've never once seen that conversation happen here in the US. And I think that is a really striking difference in the way that we think about how we have to address extremism and how we can, and so we get great counterterrorism experts together who know a lot about terrorism and know a lot about what happens at the endpoint, but might not really know as much in depth about what is it that takes ordinary young people down a deviant path? What is it that motivates them, and how are particularly the emotional parts of that motivation, right? Not just the structural grievances and the ideological things, which in my research should come later, the ideological stuff, but the desire to be a hero, the desire to belong to something bigger than themselves, the desire to make a difference, to enact meaning in their life. And when we don't have spaces to offer them those kinds of things, and someone else comes along and offers it to them, they are attracted to it. And I think until we figure out ways to capture that at a younger age, all the monitoring and surveillance is going to remain just a too little too late situation. And so those are conversations I'd love to have. I think we're not really having that much, but no critique of the panel at all. I think I see lots of nodding, and I think folks agree, but I think it is a national crisis in the sense of not really tapping into some of the experts. And those experts aren't well linked to issues of terrorism either. They're not really addressing it. But pulling together a meeting like that would be really interesting, I think, at some point.
Eric, you had a two-finger on that, and then Mary, and then Sarah.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously couldn't agree more with that assessment, and I think I alluded to in my remarks, but just to unpack it more quickly, the opportunity we have now with all the attention on non-Islamist related violence in this country allows, I think, for a restart of a conversation around prevention or countering of violent extremism in the United States that isn't perceived as focused on one specific religious community or and community of individuals, which is Muslims. And I think that opportunity is not going to last forever. And I think we should, policymakers on the Hill and elsewhere should really look hard at this opportunity, because we finally can have, I think, an even playing field where we're looking at all forms of violence, not in a sort of wink-wink way, but in a real way. And I think it's, my fear though is that because of the connections, the perceived connections or real connections between right-wing extremism and certain political parties, fringes, whatever in this country, that certain segments of Congress will resist this opportunity, will not seize the opportunity, because they don't want to connect the dots between right-wing extremism and jihadi extremism.
It's actually remarkably like exactly what I was going to say, so I won't repeat what you just heard from Eric, except to say that we spent a lot of time when I was in government trying to bring people to the table, and we did in fact have a lot of roundtables with social workers actually, and with researchers, and including from other countries where they're much more heavily engaged in prevention programs, Germany among them, and Canada and elsewhere. And part of the problem that we consistently encountered, as Eric alluded to, is that at that time, even though we weren't saying these words, the perception in the Muslim community in the US is that not only were they the targets of our counterterrorism efforts in terms of investigations, but also the targets of the prevention efforts. And CVE, even though it's a neutral term, to many of these communities was a loaded term. And I had a lot of discussions with groups like Muslim Advocates and Arab American Institute. I'm going to their gala tonight. I made good, close friends with those ones to try to talk about, well, how do we get over that and into the core problem, which, as Cynthia said, which is what is driving young people to have such a lack of meaning in their life that they go down either the jihadist path or the far right-wing extremist path in order to find more meaning. And it's so easy now because they can do it all online. They don't have to even find people in their communities to meet face-to-face with. They have those online places. So I agree with Eric. This is the opportunity, even though the last administration sort of tried to make it apply across the board, this is actually a real opportunity to, I think, reapproach that and see if there can't be some creativity in this space. Andrew mentioned the Madison Dollywood project. This was a project during the last administration where the government brought together Madison Avenue advertising executives, Hollywood producers, and Silicon Valley tech sector people, and we had it was actually at DOJ, we had all these tables, and we all spent the entire day like brainstorming on ideas for sort of positive counter messaging and things like that, and nothing has really taken off, nothing has really worked, and so it's a huge quandary, and work needs to be put into this, and I hope we can do so.
Sarah, maybe you could speak a little bit also to the motivations and why they radicalize. You interviewed a lot of, or some of the women in the alt-right and right-wing violent extremism movement.
So I first want to just quickly address the gentleman in the back's question about the distinction between white nationalism and extremism, and return to Erin's first point she made about how this all occurs in a vacuum. So I think we need to be cognizant of the fact that increased nationalism often connotes a kind of culturally and ethnically stringent set of ideals that are in need of defense from invaders, and this idea of the nation as something that is vulnerable to attack, that is this breathing creature that we identify with that needs protection, can indeed motivate actors through this framework to take on extremist action. So on the continuum, white nationalism can in fact lead to extremism, but an element that I found particularly salient for women susceptible to radicalization was the role of trauma. And there's not a huge amount of research on this matter yet, but the two principal former neo-Nazi extremists that I interviewed for my research both experienced rape as young adolescents, and the rage and kind of identity crisis that this conversion point served in their lives pushed them into organizations that allowed them to express their rage. And this kind of pivot out-of-body experience where a binary worldview is adopted in the aftermath of such trauma or experience is a common narrative I've heard for why someone could decide to associate with such an organization.
Okay, thank you. Let's go back. Yeah, the woman in the back, and then the gentleman in front of her, and woman here.
Ashley Burrell, formerly with the Counterterrorism Bureau at the State Department. Mary McCord, you mentioned that the moral equivalency between the right-wing extremism and left-wing extremism, and how Congress is, I guess you could say, well-positioned to have oversight over the FBI and obtain some of that better data on domestic terrorism, and then share that information with our partners. If you could speak a little bit more to that, and as well as how can we expand that toolkit, that toolbox that Rosand mentioned, and some of the first steps that members of Congress should take?
My question is also for Mary and Eric to some extent also, and it's, you talked a little bit about how there's kind of this problem of not having a criminal statute on the books to prosecute a lot of breeding domestic terrorism, and rather it's prosecuted post hoc after the action's already happened and you can bring them in on a homicide or whatever. Are there any proposals for what a statute might look like, something like maybe similar to RICO or similar to our foreign terrorism statutes, so that we could get it more in the early conspiracy phase and not have to worry about it after the damage has already been done?
Thank you, and then the woman here.
Oh.
Hi, I'm Nicole Garing from Wayne State University. Question is for Cynthia or any other panelists who may have ideas about this, but to what extent can sort of promoting positive masculinity or fighting toxic masculinity, as we can see that actually reduce violent extremism? Is it effective? And also, how important would it be for women, right, as recipients of this education or the socialization process?
Okay, thank you, and I will add one last question. Or Maya, you have a question? Go ahead.
Yeah, just briefly, sort of, we were talking about the sort of counterterrorism perspective, and I know a lot of counterterrorism perspectives or counterviolent, counter-radicalization programs really focus on young males. I know I'm relatively familiar with a couple of the Belgian perspectives to do counterviolence, and that's specifically on, age, sort of vulnerable males on that side. But as we're seeing more women joining these organizations, how do we now need to change these counter-radicalization programs to really fit the mold for women and men, and making sure that, you know, as we're targeting counter-radicalization for men, we're not leaving sort of women to take the forefront.
And then last question, you know, imagine if I were the president of an important foundation giving away research money, what would be the research projects that you would like to be funded? Mary, why don't you start us off?
Great, thanks. So I'll try to hit both of those questions kind of at once. I think that one starting place for Congress is frankly to get a good threat picture, and that's by having, you know, hearings, bringing in experts who've been studying this to talk about what is the threat picture. Our intelligence community briefs Congress on a regular basis about the Islamist extremist threat picture and the foreign terrorist extremist threat picture. And so some of that data is not going to be in the hands of our intel community because they haven't been collecting on it and shouldn't be if it's domestic. And it's not going to be in the hands necessarily of a lot of government researchers, but it's certainly in the hands of organizations like ADL and SPLC and University of Maryland and others that have been collecting data on events here in the US and the proliferation of this kind of far-right extremist thinking. So get a good threat picture, and then start thinking about things like a domestic terrorism statute. And I actually do have a proposal, as a matter of fact, and I have been talking with some people on the Hill about it. And it starts with this. It starts with making the actual crimes of violence, so murder, mayhem, kidnapping, assault with a dangerous weapon, assault that results in significant bodily injury, when done with the intent that is already in our federal criminal code as part of the definition of what terrorism is, and that is the intent to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, or to influence the policy of government through intimidation or coercion. So you commit that crime with that intent, or you attempt to commit it, or conspire to commit it, then that becomes the crime of terrorism. This doesn't penalize, you know, free expression, because this is about actual crimes of violence. The other thing it would do, because a lot of people say, well, those are all crimes in the states that can be prosecuted. It's true. Homicide's a crime in all 50 states, punishable by at least life imprisonment, and in some cases death. But state crimes are inherently local crimes. It's about a one-on-one crime in the state, and a terrorism crime is bigger than that. It's bigger than one-on-one. It's bigger than the locality. It's bigger than the state, because it's done to send this message far and wide, and that's why it's also bigger than a hate crime. Although I agree that with many people who say we should do more enforcement of hate crimes. The other thing that a statute like that would do is it could become one of the enumerated statutes for a crime that's already on the books called material support to terrorists. Not material support to a foreign terrorist organization, which we talked about earlier. There's also a crime called material support to terrorists, which says if you provide resources or support or conceal or disguise the nature of resources. Resources, think stockpiling AK-47s and AR-15s, right? Resources. If you conceal or disguise the resources, knowing and intending that they be used in one of, and then there's a whole list of crimes, which are all the terrorism crimes. If you added this new domestic terrorism crime to that list, then you've got Christopher Paul Hassan. Then you've got the Coast Guard lieutenant who was stockpiling guns, researching U.S. government officials, popular people in the United States. What's the word I'm looking for? Celebrities. Thank you. He was doing his research, plotting a mass terrorist attack based on his, white supremacist views. And you know what he's charged with right now? He's charged with possession of a silencer, possession of firearms by a drug addict, and possession of drugs. And the judge in that case just last week said, I'm going to not be able to continue to detain him pre-trial because he's charged, he's not even charged with a terrorism crime, and I need an adequate sort of supervision program before I release him, but that's all I can do. If we had this regime I'm suggesting, then that kind of plotting, that kind of thing could be prosecuted. And I don't want to suggest over-prosecution is the way. This is just my background. This is what I know. This is my little piece of the puzzle. And as others have said, it's a much bigger problem with that. And then to go to the other question, again, to address the concerns that the FBI, there's such distrust of law enforcement in our country, some of it very valid because law enforcement have abused their authorities in the past and they've certainly targeted unpopular ideologies in the past, but the reason for oversight would be to sort of ensure that they're putting the resources to where the actual threat of violence is. And then that information would produce data, to go to your question, it would produce data on a yearly basis about what we're seeing here, not only in what investigations are being opened up, what's actually resulting in a prosecution, and all the acts would have to funnel through the Department of Justice the way international terrorist prosecutions do. And the Department of Justice has 100% perfect data on international terrorism prosecutions in this country, and it doesn't have anything remotely like that on the domestic terrorism side.
Cynthia?
Sure. I will take the question about the toxic masculinity and what we might do about women. So I have seen some interventions, not so much, there are interventions that focus on masculinity, but what I have seen that I think is more innovative is looking at some of those emotional impulses that draw young people in, that tend to be more male-driven or masculinity-driven, like the heroism kind of complex. So there's a really interesting intervention that tries to pair at-risk youth in Germany, both on the jihadi side and on the foreign fighter side, and also on the far right, with firefighters. And the idea is, can you get them to, can you channel that emotional need or emotional impulse in a more positive way? And can we think about interventions? Now there's a lot of monitoring that has to happen in order to identify those at-risk youth. That's another problem. But when those youth are identified, can you then put them in an intervention that's not just kind of counter ideas or counter ideology, but also saying, what is it that we need emotionally and how we can drive that? And a lot of those are connected to these issues of masculinity. And Maya, I don't have a great answer on the question of women, although there are a lot of folks working on it. But I do think that we definitely need to target that. I would say, again, I think some of the things, and this gets to the question about what I would ask for a Magic Foundation who wanted to wave a card, and which is an empirically driven, large-scale, scalable intervention where we could test the outcomes of multiple pilot sites to assess what works to improve empathy, to improve things like forgiveness, cross-cultural understanding, sense of belonging, the kinds of emotional impulses that we know are at the root of this across the board that women are affected by, young women are affected by, and men are affected by, and that we know a little bit about, but not enough about. And I would say that has to be also a public-private partnership, not just foundation, ideally government funding, but also the company is already doing a global empathy project, but it's not really looped into these conversations, right, around preventing extremism. So there are experts out there doing this kind of work, but the conversations aren't quite fitting the puzzle pieces together, and so that's what I would call for, is large-scale funding for empathy.
Yeah, and working backwards, in terms of the research project, I would certainly support the last idea, but I think even taking a step back, I think there needs to be some investment in the sort of looking at the connections or not between right-wing extremist violence and jihadi violence and international terrorism in general. I think there's been a lot of sort of, I'm as guilty of this as the next person, sort of somewhat knee-jerk reaction to the events as they happen. And being forced to sit on panels and or welcoming to sitting on panels, but, and sort of having to opine on stuff where I frankly, I'm relying on my expertise, quote unquote expertise from another field, but I'm doing it sort of pretty slapdash, and I think a lot of us are doing that. And I think there needs to be a sort of a serious investment that looks at both the United States and abroad, the connections, whether it's on the drivers, it's connections in the policy responses, on the programming, on the frameworks, in an in-depth way, and that could feed into this other idea that was mentioned, or be part of it. The second point, I think, on the comment about counter-radicalization programs focusing on women, I think we should be so lucky to have that be our challenge in the United States. We have an even bigger challenge. We need counter-radicalization programs at all, focused on men or women, and some funding for them. We don't have that anymore from Washington. So I think that again gets to my larger point about this massive gap in our architecture for dealing with the problems we're talking about. And this last point, and it relates somewhat to the questions, but not so much, is that we have to be careful in one of the reasons why jihadi violence, when we talk about in this country, is so difficult to get a sort of the multi-stakeholder involvement that we all many of us recognize is needed, is because so many of the non-law enforcement, non-security, non-government stakeholders think it's a national security issue, think it's a law enforcement issue, think it's really connected to foreign policy or government policy. And we should be careful not to bring right-wing extremism into that discussion. And so where the barriers to entry will still be the same, what we need to do is create a separate space for that discussion in some ways that is driven by not sort of how to link it up to jihadi violence, but how to just look at violence prevention more broadly in the United States. That's sort of, again, turning the page from what has prevented us from having the kinds of multidimensional responses and programming and policy frameworks that we all realize is needed. And again, jihadi violence is too often being treated as a violence apart, a different kind of violence from all the other kinds of violence in the United States. And there's a risk that we bring right-wing extremist violence into that very distinct bucket, or perceived to be distinct bucket. And I think we don't want to go there, because we need to break down this notion that there is sort of jihadi violence and right-wing violence are that different from other forms of targeted violence in our communities.
Mary, you have to figure on that, and then I turn to Audrey for your response.
I just think another research project is the connection of the sort of rise of the militia movement in the U.S. and its connection to far-right extremism. Our case in Charlottesville was based on state anti-private militia and anti-paramilitary activity statutes, and we were able to get injunctive relief court orders preventing 23 of the white supremacist individuals and groups and militia groups from returning to Charlottesville in the form of this organized use of force. And we're seeing now, I was on the phone with folks in New Mexico yesterday, because we have a militia self-deployed to the New Mexico border, started illegally detaining migrants there and holding them for Customs and Border Patrol. Totally answerable to no governmental authority, completely arrogating unto themselves where and when to use lethal force with their AR-15s. And this is a movement, and I'd be particularly interested in women's involvement in this movement, to get back to the women's issue piece, because we see women in these organizations. They don't always, it's interesting, before Unite the Right, a number of the groups said, women, you guys stay back and take care of like the media and stuff, and the men will do the fighting, but the women are involved. And I saw on the border one of the most prolific social media users putting out the videos of this group, the United Constitutional Patriots, which they're not, what is a woman who's putting out their propaganda on a daily basis. So this is becoming widespread. 48 states, their constitutions prohibit private militias, and it's time for governors and state attorney generals to really sort of crack down on this.
Great, thanks. Audrey?
So absolutely behind that, and sort of, I think that one of the challenges is there's a historical legacy when we look at the study of gender and terrorism and violent extremism. And the first sort of complaint is that bad and unreliable documentation has shaped where we've been and how we understand where we've been. So of course it shapes where we're going, from the IRA to the LTTE, all of these groups, and sort of the legacy that they've left is that we're actually still working to understand them. Because if you look at research about women and violent extremism, it's really been over the last 10, if you're generous, 20 years. But women have been in these organizations since what we know today as modern terrorism in Russia. Like, so they've always been part of the picture, but we haven't always talked about it. So we're still playing a bit of catch up with that, which is fine, but being able to say that as an outset. And the other really big challenge to this, and something that we need to remain super aggressive about moving forward is that gender is not the same as women, and those two are not the same thing. So when we say gender, we need to say, okay, well, what about masculinity and femininity, and what's the interplay? How are these militia groups going to the border to protect women, protect our women from being raped by migrants? And the rhetoric behind all of this is deeply engendered, and engendered by gender, sorry. But I think really understanding this interplay, and also the other caveat here is realizing that just how deeply these problems are intersectional. It's not just about gender, race, education, socioeconomics. Really identifying these problems as a start can help us start to unpack what are all of the pieces we need to look at. And is gender something we need to identify as sort of like a forthright, well, you're doing this because of masculinity and femininity, or sort of more of these latent perspectives. And we need to keep that in mind in our own evaluations. So I think trying to put money on these questions and still improving documentation is one of the first steps.
Okay, thanks. Erin?
I just wanted to follow up on that, as well as Nicole's question earlier about the relevance of toxic masculinity. I actually think it's also very important to consider that on the with respect not only to people who might carry out violence, but in terms of targeting, right? So I think that there is a lot of public education needed and education of law enforcement about the sort of salience of misogyny with respect to targeting. There's been a lot more focus on this in recent years. I'll raise the incel movement in particular as something that has gotten a vast amount more of attention just in the past few years than it had before that, to the point where in 2014, when an individual carried out an attack on his roommates and then carried out an attack on students at UC Santa Barbara, I think, we didn't include that in the Global Terrorism database. When I remember reading about the attack, the way it was described by law enforcement at the time made it sound like a pretty personal, idiosyncratic, this guy was just mad because he didn't have a girlfriend, or he's mad at his girlfriend, or wanted a girlfriend, and it was very personal and sort of, it wasn't until a couple years later when I got to page 130 of the manifesto where there are clear ideological, New World Order, extremely racist, extremely sexist language that creates actually a fairly comprehensive ideological framework for violence. This isn't obviously particularly new. I think this year is the 30th anniversary of the mass killing at the Montreal Polytechnic School, the targeted female engineering students. So it's not a brand new thing, but I do think that there are, as we've seen in recent years, more and more influences of misogyny that are sort of intertwined with racism and white supremacy that are leading to violent attacks in ways that, if you just sort of look at it in a really superficial way, you might not even notice. It just might seem like sort of, if people are very inclined to write certain folks off as, he snapped or something like that, and we've had to, be careful to not, be careful to look into these cases further to see if there's a deeper ideology that's influencing them.
Sarah, you have the last word.
I'd just like to thank everyone for making time to join us today for this discussion and for elevating the profile of far-right violent extremism, or however we decide to define it going forward, as something that, whether or not needs the same kind of toolkit or an entirely new space, as you mentioned, Eric, to address, that we take it seriously as civil society actors, government actors, and just citizens. So thank you all.